And Moses spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Now when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled. And they stood far off and said to Moses, You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die. Moses said to the people, Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. The people stood far off while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was.
That's Exodus 19 into chapter 20, and we're going to push even a little further than that. So if you're brand new here, you've caught us right in the middle of Exodus. It's okay. We can do one of those quick recaps, just like if you're going through a TV show and it like recaps everything in those like 10 seconds. I can do it in like 10 seconds. God has come to a man named Moses, who had been raised in the palace of Pharaoh. And Exodus gives a little more background story of how Moses, how he had grown up and how his mom and his dad had faith to save him and put him in a basket, floated him down the river. He grows up in the household of Pharaoh, this great king of Egypt. And as Moses grows up, he's schooled in all the ways of Egypt. He becomes like an Egyptian. But one day he looks out, and at some point, something in him says, I'm not Egyptian. These are my people, the Israelites. And he sees one of his fellow Israelites being beaten. He doesn't like it. He wants to do something. At that moment, this deliverer part of Moses kicks in. And he sets out to do something about it. He sees this injustice, and he goes to set it right. And unfortunately, he doesn't do it the right way. He just knocks this guy out and kills him. And then it becomes known, and Moses finds out it's known, and he runs away. He spends 40 years as a shepherd. And those 40 years as a shepherd, Moses kind of like just gets comfortable where he's at. But then God shows up in this bush, this burning bush. It's this bush that's on fire in the middle of the wilderness while Moses is just doing all the things a shepherd would do. He sees this fire that's burning, but it's not being consumed. This bush is not being consumed. So he goes over. What is this? It's God. God's shown up in a bush there in the wilderness. And he says to Moses, I've got something for you. I want you to go deliver my people. Moses is like, no, you got the wrong guy. And there's this argument that ensues. But then God gets his way. He pushes through. Moses reluctantly goes. And with the help of his brother Aaron, they bring the people of Israel through God's plagues out of Egypt. So they're on the other side of Egypt, and we've seen God bring his people out of Egypt. We've seen God deliver them since they've been out of Egypt at the Red Sea, where the waters part and the people cross over, and then the water comes back down on Pharaoh's army. And God says, I'm bigger than this Pharaoh. He's defeated all the gods of Egypt, and now he says, I'm greater than this final god, really, Pharaoh. Then the people are hungry. They don't know what to do, so they're looking for food and water, and God shows up again. He gives them food and water. It's amazing how God comes through for his people, how he's so kind to his people, because they're complaining the whole time, and yet God takes care of his people. And so that's where we find ourselves now. After God has picked out this guy named Moses, and he said, go deliver my people, and God brings his people out of Egypt, what does he do next? And as we think about that question, I'm going to give you another question. What's the most awe-inspiring event you've ever seen in your life? What is it, maybe in nature, possibly? What is it that you just went, whoa, that was crazy? You were completely in awe. Maybe you have a story like that where you just felt overpowered in some way. The best story I have for me personally is when we had this thunderstorm come up on our house. And I've had this happen before. You know those kind of thunderstorms that we get in the South, especially during the summer, where it just can go crazy, just big thunders and lightning. And, like the thunder can be so loud and powerful that it will shake your house. Anybody ever experienced that before? And so that in itself is a lot, but it just so happened that on one of these storms, when they rolled up, our family was in our dining room of our house. As we sat in the dining room, we had all these windows in that dining room in our house. We looked out, and there's this tree that I was really proud of. I love trees, and this tree in particular was an old, just big tree right in the middle of our backyard, just 6, 7, 8 feet from the back of our house. And this dining room where you would sit would just make you a few feet from that tree, this huge old oak tree. And as this storm comes on us, and we're kind of just hanging out there in the dining room for the moment, out of nowhere, after we've been hearing some thunder and we've seen little flashes, but out of nowhere, just the biggest, imagine just the loudest boom you've heard in your life, and that's what it felt like, at least for us in the moment, when the thunder and the lightning, usually I'm going to mess this up, but you hear thunder and then you see lightning. Is that the way it works? Is that the order? And then you can count off like how far, and then you know how far away it is. Well, we heard thunder and saw lightning at the same time because it struck the tree right there behind our dining room. Boom. It felt like a bomb had exploded. In fact, I thought somebody had literally set off a bomb at our house. It was so powerful and so overwhelming that I'm jumping under the table. I don't know what my kids and my wife did, but I was under the table, fending for myself. And I think at some point I threw some kids under the table too. It just happened so quickly, and it was just boom, lightning. The light. I can't describe it. It was so powerful. Have you ever had an event like that? You just felt overpowered like that. Now, picture this here in Exodus when God shows up. And it's not just one thunder and one lightning that explodes, but it's continuous. That's how they describe. They're at this mountain called Sinai, and here at this mountain, they're like, okay, God, you brought us out here. You gave us food. You gave us water. Now what? And he's like, I'm going to show you what. And they're here before God at this mountain, and it's lightning and it's thunders. And the people, if you notice, as we read there at the end of chapter 20, they were like, we're scared. Moses, we're scared. This God, I don't know, can you go talk to him? So the way in which God presents himself here is a way in which it's just completely awe-inducing for any of us that would have been there. Picture the most awe-inspiring moment and then multiply it, because you've got thunder, you've got lightning, you've got the trumpet blaring. And this is the scene where God's people are before God in the book of Exodus. And what we're going to see take place here in these chapters, I'm really covering where Robbie left off last week. If you were here last week with us, he covered 6 verses, and he made a joke, and he's like, Joel's going to cover 6 chapters. Yeah, basically I am. We're gonna go all the way into chapter 24 because, and it makes sense because as we look at these chapters together in the book of Exodus, it forms one whole in the sense that God is making a covenant with his people. If you go from chapter 19 to chapter 24, this is all about God making a covenant with his people. And so we're going to talk today about a God that you see the subtitle on our, sorry, Jacob, you were right on time and I messed up. You see the subtitle on our screen here, the God who saves. That's what Exodus is about. It's about this God who comes and delivers his people. And when he delivers his people and he saves his people, what's next is he says, I want to make a covenant with my people. And so that's our chapters from 19 to 24. This is the covenant God. And we're going to look at three parts. We're going to watch God's people witness this covenant God, hear this covenant God, and eat with this covenant God. And we're going to work our way through those three headings. So watch, hear, and eat with the covenant God. And just to set it up, and so you guys can kind of prepare yourself as we go through this as well. That last part, eating with the covenant God, we'll read in chapter 24 that they had this meal with God. And we will, after this sermon, we will take communion together. And we will have a meal, not really a meal, but what's symbolic of the meal to share with the Lord today. All right, so first, let's talk about witnessing the covenant God. Witnessing the covenant God. And that is what I just described to you, where the Israelites are seeing this powerful God in a way they haven't seen him. Even though they've seen him deliver these plagues on Egypt, you might remember he sent gnats, he sent frogs, he turned water into blood, and all those things, they have not yet seen God like they're seeing him now in this powerful, awe-inspiring display. Well, when you think about them witnessing the covenant God, first you have to understand that the God of the Bible is a covenant God. That sounds a little foreign to our ears because we don't go around saying, hey, Colby, let's make a covenant together. The only time you might hear it is in a marriage. You say this is a covenant that they're making together. But on a regular basis, we don't go around saying, let's sign a covenant in agreement today. Maybe the closest thing we have to it is, those like 20-page long things you scroll through as you're about to having to like agree to something. You guys know, like when it's like, hey, read this. This is our terms and conditions, and you have to click I agree. You know what I'm talking about? Maybe that's the closest thing we have to it, where they're making us read all that we'll never read, and basically saying, if you don't follow all these things, then we're going to sue you. And so that's essentially kind of what we get with a covenant. That God is a covenant God. Looks a little different in the ancient Near East. That's the time period we're in right now, where first we witness God make a covenant with Noah. If you know the story of Noah and how God floods the earth, and after God floods the earth, he says, I will never do this again. And my covenant, my sign of the covenant will be, I'll put a rainbow in the sky. He makes a covenant with Abraham. He picks Abraham out and he says, Abraham, I'm going to make you a very important person in the whole scheme of things. I'm picking you out because through you, Abraham, I'm going to bless the whole world. And he chooses Abraham and he says, I'm going to make a covenant with you. This is in Genesis 15 when he performs a covenant ceremony with Abraham. He asks Abraham to get a cow, a goat, a ram, a dove, and a pigeon, and to cut those animals in half, set one part of the animal on one side, one animal on the other side. And in this ceremony, God says, here's the covenant I'm making with you. And here's just one part of what God says to Abraham. I want you to look at this in Genesis chapter 15. I'll put this on the screen there. He says, know for certain, he's speaking to Abraham, hundreds of years before what happens in Exodus. Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years, but I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with a great possession. That's in Genesis 15. This is when God's making a covenant with Abraham, and he promises his people, he promises Abraham, look, I know what's going to happen, and now this story that we're in is living proof that God keeps his promise, that God keeps his covenant. And as Abraham sets out those pieces of the animals, you might think in a normal covenant ceremony, here's what would happen. They would set the pieces of animals out and both would walk through together. through that line of animals, and they would say, may it be like these animals if we don't fulfill the vows of this covenant. And in this case, though, it's very interesting because in Genesis 15, here's what it tells. It tells us what happens that Abraham has a deep sleep come upon him, and that this fire pot and a flaming torch he sees comes through that line of the animals. This flaming torch and this fire pot represents God. It's just like the burning bush. God's presence is somehow in those things. And as it goes through those line of animals, God is saying to Abraham, here's what I'm going to do to you. I'm going to make you a father of many, many people. I'm going to bless you. Anybody who curses you, I'm going to curse them. And as I come through for you, Abraham, that's it. I'll come through for you. And you won't walk through in this covenant ceremony with me because this is completely one-sided. God says when he makes this covenant with Abraham, this is my covenant I'm making with you. And I know you're going to mess up. I know your descendants are going to mess up. But this is a covenant from God that's completely one-sided and unconditional that he makes here with Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. So God's a God of a covenant. And so when the people come up to Mount Sinai and start to enter this covenant with God, he's got a track record. He's always faithful to his promises. One theologian I like to read, his name is John Walton. He explains why covenants are so important. This might help you understand it, what's happening here. Covenants reveal that God's relationships are rooted in love, loyalty, and commitment. In the ancient world, covenants brought stability, and they were seen as a framework through which God's faithfulness and blessings flowed. Through covenant, God bound himself to his people, and he promised never to abandon them. This covenant that God is making with his people is binding himself to them. That was the whole point of a ceremony like that they would be bound together to say that we will not part ways in this. So when we think about God, here at this mountain, with all the majesty, with all the thunder and the lightning, this gives us a picture of what he's like. We even see it in Jesus. God reveals himself in Jesus. When Jesus comes to earth, God is revealing himself in a way in which we can handle. And yet there still is this piece of where we see in Jesus that's really completely terrifying, just like it was for the people there at Sinai. You might remember the story where Jesus is with his disciples and they're in this terrible storm where the disciples, when they're on the boat, think they're going to die. They turn to Jesus, are you going to do anything? Why is this happening? And he stands up and he says, peace, be still. And the storm completely stops. Now, the disciples don't go up to Jesus and say, whoa, bro, that was awesome, so great. Man, that was crazy. They don't do that. When Jesus calms a storm, they step back and they go, whoa, who is this guy? I'm afraid. Because it's completely terrifying to see someone have that sort of power over the elements like that. And so this is the God that they're witnessing, this God at Sinai, who's made a covenant already, who's stuck by his covenant already, and who will now make a new covenant with his people. Second, I want to talk about hearing the covenant God, and that's what moves us into chapter 20. Israel witnessed this covenant God, and really in the only way in which they could do so without dying, and now they're going to hear from the covenant God. And that's where we get the 10 words, or otherwise known as the 10 commandments of God. Some of the most famous words in all of the world are the 10 commandments. In Exodus 20, they're simply called the 10 words. And this is a summary of the law, in which when we get to the New Testament, we get an even briefer summary of the 10. This 10 right here summarizes really all of the laws that we'll get all the rest of the way through Exodus, even in these next couple chapters, into Leviticus and Deuteronomy. These 10 commandments summarize all of what God wants for people. In the New Testament, like I just said, they're summarized even in a more succinct way. What is that? Love the Lord your God, with all your heart, soul, and mind, and what? Love your neighbor as yourself. So those 2 commands sum up the whole 10, which the whole 10 sums up all of God's law. And so here in Exodus 20, the people hear God's words because God is a God who speaks. He spoke the world into existence. And when Jesus is introduced in the Gospel of John, it says that he is the Word who became flesh. So the Bible tells us that God speaks and that we can hear him. And that's what happens here in Exodus chapter 20. They're given the 10 words. You probably have heard all of those before that we just read. And here's the thing. Most people, when they encounter the 10 commandments, have a wrong conception of what they are. We're going to jump to some conclusions about what these are and what they mean to our life. And I'll give you 3 ways in which we do that. 3 ways when we think about God's law that we kind of misconceive them. First, we think of them as detached. When we think of God's law, we think of them as just rules to follow. I want you to notice this important truth. Look at verse 2 of Exodus 20, how God describes himself. First, in verse 1, God spoke all these words. So here's the God that speaks, and the people hear. And then in verse 2, he says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Before he ever says, don't have another God before me, God says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. There's relationship before there's rules. As one commentator I read said, the grace that saves preceded the law that demands. We think of them as God just sort of like, hey, saying to us, here's some rules to follow. But in fact, God says, the very nature of what I'm asking you to do is completely about my relationship with you. What I'm asking you to follow is because I am the God who brought you out of Egypt. If you keep reading, you'll keep seeing that phrase pop up. Here in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, you'll see that phrase pop up over and over. I'm the God who brought you out of Egypt. I'm the God who brought you out of Egypt. God's saying, what I'm asking you to do is because I love you. I'm the God who heard your cries. I'm the God who came and rescued you. And so now, as I give you this law, know that first. Rightly seeing the law as personal, because in the law we see the character of God. It's not detached. It's not just rules to follow. In the law, we actually see God. Another chapter that gives some of these laws is in Leviticus 19. And before God begins the laws there, he says, be holy, for I am holy. He is saying, in following what I have set out for you to follow, you're not just following a set of rules, you're following who I am. You're following me as the God who's brought you out of Egypt. This is my character. The second way we kind of misconceive what the law is we can think it's arbitrary. We might think, well, this is just God, and whatever whims he has, this is what he gives us to do. Some may believe that God was being controlling and just wants to set whatever rules that he likes and wants to have people following. Maybe you would think of someone on the playground back when you're in elementary school who would like be trying to play a game, and as they played the game, they would just like set the rules however would like best make them win. You know what I'm talking about? That person? I hope you weren't that person. That was like, hey, let's play this game, and then they set up all the rules, and you're like, that was all for you. You did it for yourself. But that's not the case in what we see truly in the law. Alec Motyer says it like this: When we live out the law, it triggers in us the image of God, which is our real nature. In other words, we live the truly human life when we obeyed the Lord's law. Another pastor named Tim Keller comments similar. He says, the law is not busy work assigned just to please the arbitrary whims of a capricious deity. The law of God simply shows us what human beings were built to do: to worship God alone, to love their neighbors as themselves, to tell the truth, to keep their promises, to forgive everything, to act with justice. When we move against these laws, we move against our own natures and happiness. The law is not just an arbitrary whim, but it is what sets the course for us to live as we were truly meant to live. And the third way we can misconceive the law is that we can think it's limiting. That makes sense. We hear in the law something that we really don't feel like doing in the moment. We would rather tell a lie, and not being able to tell that lie feels limiting to us. Not being able to covet after something, not being able to be in an adulterous relationship feels limiting in the moment. But all of us know that boundaries and limitations are needed for us to actually live in freedom. That's not like debated in any form or fashion. All like study after study will tell you that boundaries are needed to actually live in freedom. No one has to tell you that when you're like on this balcony overlooking, a steep drop off, maybe in a stadium, and when they have a barrier right there, you don't think of that barrier like some kind of bar that's keeping you from falling over as limiting. You're like, oh, that actually allows me to move around without feeling like I'm going to fall over or actually falling over at any moment. This barrier is keeping me in a good place. So as we think about the law, make sure we're not thinking about it in those ways. God didn't say, hey, I'm going to deliver you out of slavery just to enslave you again. He doesn't do that in our lives. When God saves us, if you've known God in a way in which he has saved you, forgiven you of your sins, and brought you into a relationship with himself, he doesn't say to you, now I'm giving you these commands to follow so that you can be enslaved again. No, these are the commands that allow us to walk out our true nature and who God's created us to be. So rightly seen, the law is actually personal, it's true, and it's freeing. It's personal and it's true and it's freeing. We'll talk more about the law as we continue through Exodus, but I wanted to set it up that way. I thought it was important to see it that way because the people hear the words of God, and here's what we need to know up front about it. And finally, I want to push into chapter 24 as we finish today. I want you to see that the people have witnessed the covenant God, they've heard the covenant God, now they eat with the covenant God. And this is, we're going to look at verse 7. I'll put that on the screen. And I want you to just follow along with what is happening here, okay? Then Moses took the book of the covenant and he read it in the hearing of the people. That's verse 7. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. Which we could kind of stop and laugh at for a second because it's not going to last very long. We say the same thing, God, I promise I'm going to do it. And then it doesn't take long that we go back on our promise to God. Verse 8, and Moses took the blood and threw it on the people. He had just asked the people to bring these animals for sacrifice. And when he had slaughtered the animals, they had taken the blood, they had put it in these basins, and then he takes the blood out of these basins and he starts to throw it on the people. Remember, they're still sitting here at Sinai in front of this mountain. God has spoken his law to them. They've seen the thunder, they've seen the lightning and the flashes, they've heard the trumpets, and just everything is loud and crazy. If you thought it was loud at Sanford Stadium last night, it's like, this is crazy. As God rains down on them and he speaks to them these 10 words and the rest of his law. And now it comes back to the people, and they say, we'll do what you're asking us to do. And Moses just takes the blood and he throws it on the people. Just, you ever been at Disney World or one of those parks where you're like in a 4D theater and the smoke blows up and you feel a little water on you? Well, in this case, in this 4D theater, they get blood thrown on them. Just imagine the blood hitting you. I kind of wish today we could make this into a 4D theater and we could have done it. You guys really would have felt what it was like to be in this moment here where blood's hot, warm blood is on your face and you're like wanting to wipe it off. And you're in this very serious moment. I know it's gruesome, right? I'm going to make a point from this because for this covenant to happen, sacrifice was necessary. For this covenant to happen between the God and the people, this sacrifice was necessary to seal the covenant with them, to say this covenant is real and it's active, and to depart from it again, we would be like these animals that were cut up. We'd be like these animals that were slaughtered. We would have to pay. As they feel the blood on them, they have to sit with the seriousness, because Moses says, behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. They have said, we will follow what God has put out before us. And we'll come back to that in just a second. I want you to see what happens next. Then Moses and Aaron, verse 9. Then Aaron, that's Aaron's two sons, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. I'm going to pause there for a second. They saw God. That's what verse 10 says. They saw God. And there was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God, and they ate and they drank. They beheld God, and they had a meal. Now, when they tried to describe what happened here, the very best words they could come up with were like even a little hard for us to understand in verse 10. That when they saw God, they don't mention like he had eyes and ears. They say, we saw something under his feet. When they describe God, that's the best they could do. There was something under his feet, and it was very, very clear. Because for them to see God was this moment that they probably never could even fully fathom for the rest of their lives. To behold God, and where they should have died, God allows them to live. Because they did not, God is so other, God is so holy, that they could not be in God's presence and live. But yet God lets them live. He did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God, and they ate and they drank. Now, let's move up. Actually, I'm going to just pause there, because I want to take you from what happens in this scene, what's happened in Exodus, to what is described in Hebrews chapter 12. Put that on the screen next. There you go. The writer of Hebrews, many believe this was like a sermon, the book of Hebrews, and as they are preaching, they remind the hearers of what's different about what happened with Moses and what's different with what can happen to us. In chapter 12, verse 18, the preacher says, "For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire, and darkness, and gloom, and a tempest, and the sound of a trumpet, and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them." That's what just happened. That was the scene we just walked through. He's saying, you did not come to that place at Sinai where you could actually touch and feel and feel all, like and sense all those things happening. For they could not endure the order that was given. If even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, it was so terrifying that the sight that Moses said, I trembled with fear. He says, that's not where you went. This is where you go now. Verse 22, but you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. You see, when they were at the mountain and God had pronounced himself in this powerful, holy, inspiring, awe-inspiring kind of way, there's one thing that the people would have constantly been coming back to. As much as they said, we're going to follow this covenant, we're going to be there with you, God, every step of the way, it's not 2 seconds later, it feels like that they're off doing their own thing, forgetting God. And as much as they would want to do that, they have to keep coming back to this fact that they can't fulfill the covenant. And when they try to go to God, they don't have what it takes. When they see God in all his power and holiness, they step back and they say, we can't, we're too scared. We need someone to stand before God on our behalf. And what the writer of Hebrews shows us is that Jesus was that better mediator. While Moses played that part as best as he could, Jesus played the part and did the part to the fullest and best degree. Jesus showed us that we could come before God. He made a way before God that even when we have sinned, that we can still come to him. Here's a good summary of this. A pastor by the name of David Guzik says it like this: Sinai speaks of fear and terror, Zion of love and forgiveness. Sinai is in a dry desert, but Zion is the city of the living God. Sinai, with all its fear and power, is earthly, but Mount Zion we have come to is heavenly and spiritual. At Sinai, only Moses could come and meet God. At Zion, there's innumerable company. At Sinai, we had guilty men in fear, but Zion has just men made perfect. At Sinai, Moses is the mediator, but at Zion, Jesus is the mediator. Sinai put forth an old covenant ratified by the bloods of animals. Zion has a new covenant ratified by the blood of God's precious Son. Sinai was all about barriers and exclusion, but Zion is about invitation. Sinai is about the law. Zion is about grace. In these chapters of Exodus, as we explore the law, we realize our moral distance between us and God and our need for a mediator. And this is what points us to Jesus. Reading through the book of Exodus helps us understand why Jesus came. And I want to invite you to the table today. These people got a taste of what we get to taste and a taste of what we will taste. When they ate and drank before God and they beheld him, we have the opportunity to do the same. We have the opportunity to commune with God through Jesus Christ. We have the opportunity to do that right now, right here. But we also take the cup and the bread in anticipation of when we will be with God fully and we will see him fully and we will not be in fear at all. Through Jesus, we will have access to God in a way that we otherwise could never have. You see, I want to be very clear on this. Jesus is the better mediator because Jesus was God in flesh coming to earth. He came to earth, he lived a perfect life, a life that we could not live. He lived to the covenant, up to the covenant in every way. The law that God set forth, Jesus lived up to in every way. He was perfect. And then, because of how we have failed in the covenant that God gave his people, Jesus came and died. It was his sacrifice, it was his atonement that allowed us to have access to God because of Jesus, through him. And so today, we will eat and drink the blood of Jesus. We do not have it thrown on us, but we have it covering us. We have the blood of Jesus that we remember his death through the cup. This juice that we would take in this cup today, it is a remembrance of what Jesus has done, his sacrifice for us. The bread that we have here, it's the remembrance of his body broken for us. I'm going to invite you guys here in just a minute to come and take the cup and the bread.